Hey guys, Arleesha here, and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be doing a paint making Q&A and taking the time to answer your most frequently asked questions about making watercolors. We're going to be talking about the best beginner pigments to get started with, making your own paints versus buying pre-made professional paints, and lots of other stuff. This video is sponsored by Skillshare. It's kind of hard to believe, but it's a new year and a brand new decade. On Skillshare, you can make 2020 a year to explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and get lost in creativity. As you guys know, I have been a Skillshare teacher and a student for over 2.5 years now myself, and it really has become an invaluable resource for me. Skillshare isn't a school, it's not an academy or a university, it's a community and a collection of professionals and creatives, hobbyists, and just people who love to explore creativity from a bunch of different viewpoints. It's professionals coming together to encourage and teach you about their craft, people with years of experience who have worked to create classes that are designed for real life, so you can move your creative journey forward without putting your life on hold. I personally have been really inspired to see Chris Hong's new class. You may know Chris from here on YouTube. She has an amazing channel where she talks about watercolor and gouache, and she recently made her very first Skillshare class about creating portraits in pencil, and I have been learning so much from her class. I would highly recommend checking it out, and this is just one of thousands of classes. If you're interested in joining me and many others in this online community, you can click the link in the description to get 2 free months of premium membership and explore your creativity. One of the questions that I get most frequently is, which pigments should I start out with? If you're just getting started with making your own watercolors, there are so many options for pigments to choose. Where do you get your pigments from? There are so many different types and so many different variations of the same pigment, and can be hard to know where to start. In all of these cases, I'm going to be sharing my opinions and experiences. I'm not a professional paint maker. I've been doing this as a hobby for about a year now, and while I have experimented with a bunch of different colors from a couple different places, I don't know everything there is to know. So please keep in mind that I am just one source. During this video, while I answer your questions, I'm also going to be making yellow iron oxide. This is made from PY43. It's a really standard, easy to make color, and this leads right into the first question, which is, which pigments are best to get started for beginners? I tried to choose colors that were from a bit of a wide range, so if you started with just these colors, you would still have room to grow, and we'll talk about why it's still kind of limited in just a second. Colors I would recommend starting out with include this yellow iron oxide, nickel titanium yellow, Indian red or Venetian red. French ultramarine can be a pretty easy blue to start with, ultramarine rose, which you saw in my last paint making video, and even the cobalt teal that I have been making has been nice and easy. You may notice that the range of colors I selected here doesn't actually include a lot of bright reds or specific blues like a phthalo blue or even like an indanthrone blue, and there's very good reason for that, because those colors, when it comes to quinacridone colors or phthalo colors, lots of variety of red, a lot of varieties of blue, those colors can actually be more difficult to make, and in a lot of cases I've noticed that difficulty correlates directly to transparency, so colors that are naturally more transparent are more difficult to mull just as a handmade paint maker. Professional companies like Daniel Smith and Schminke, they have giant presses, giant rollers that are able to process the pigments in the binder in a way that one person with a muller in their hand isn't going to be able to do, not to the same capacity. It's not necessarily a matter of grinding the pigments finer, it's just doing a more efficient job of emulsifying and combining and attaching the pigment to the binder that's difficult to do from a handmade standpoint. As a result of that, handmade watercolors are oftentimes more opaque and tend to focus a little bit more on slightly earthier colors. Not necessarily all the time, but that tends to be the norm a little bit more. So far, all of my pigments have either come from earthpigments.com or from Kramer Pigments. Earth Pigments is a great place to get really affordable earth pigments. So your yellow ochres, this yellow iron oxide, I got my Indian red from there, which is PR101. My cobalt teal and my ultramarine rose are also from earthpigments.com, and I'm really happy with all of those. I haven't loved every pigment I've gotten from there, but those colors specifically have been really good to me. But when I was looking for, like, I wanted to try some more vibrant reds and I wanted phthalo blues, again, phthalo colors are very, very difficult to mull, and a lot of people who do handmade watercolors will recommend that you just steer clear of those entirely. I will say that while phthalo turquoise has been one of the most rewarding colors to make, it is the biggest headache, and I basically never want to do it again because the pigment dust, even though I'm never trying to make a big mess, ends up everywhere. It's almost like it just turns into dust, and I'm wiping it off of countertops and off of shelves that are on the other side of the room, and the phthalo pigments just get everywhere no matter how careful I am. The next question was, are handmade watercolors better than professional watercolors from brands like Daniel Smith and M. Graham, etc.? Basically, the short answer is no, they're not better. Handmade watercolors may have more individual character, and there's also the opportunity for individual people to mix pigments in a way that can be really, really unique, really fascinating. And of course, when you're buying handmade watercolors, you're supporting small businesses and the unique dreams and visions of individual creators and people, which is a super, super special thing. But the professional companies know what they're doing. They usually have long-standing records of paint making, they have very professional equipment, and they have the budgets for trial and error. So for me, if I have a little tub of quinacridone rose or a color that's very expensive, it's more difficult for me to keep trying and trying and trying to get that color right, because for me it's going to take hours and hours of mulling, and I don't know how much of my supplies I'm going to use up at once to get it right. When you're talking about big companies, they just have the ability and the budgets to make it right and to get it right, and they have scientists who are testing things, and just there's a lot more knowledge that comes from these larger companies, and I don't berate them at all. I think that if you're looking for one specific color, it's easier to just buy it from a professional brand than it is trying to make that color in most cases. From just an ease standpoint, this kind of does lead into the next question, which is making handmade paints expensive? The answer is it can be, but it doesn't have to be. So depending on the pigments you start with and where you get your supplies, it can range from a moderate investment in the beginning to being very expensive right out of the gate. For example, the color Yellow Iron Oxide, this 100-gram container, only cost me about $3.83, I believe is what it's listed at currently. And this 100 grams of pigment will make a lot of paint. I've currently made maybe a dozen half pans of this color, and I still have a ton of pigment left, and even a dozen pans of this color is more than I will use in a very, very long time, especially because I have other brands of paint. By comparison, this Indenthrone Blue, which is from Kramer Pigments, this is only 20 grams, so this is 1/5 of the amount, and it cost me $16. So this tiny bit of pigment is way more expensive. That being said, when making Yellow Iron Oxide, it's like a 1-to-1 ratio, so equal parts binder and pigment, so you're using more pigment for this one, to where the Indenthrone Blue is closer to like a 10-to-1 ratio. So it does level out a little bit in that regard, because you're going to use way less pigment for some of these more expensive colors, but at the same time, that initial investment can still be a lot. When you're paying $15 to $25 to $40 per pigment, the cost can add up if you're trying a lot of different colors. That being said, you could easily get a trio of earthier colors with maybe an ultramarine blue for $10 to $15 to $20, like a small set of earthy colors. And if you were able to find a glass slab that was maybe repurposed or recycled like I did, get yourself a muller and some little bits of things like palette knives, glycerin, honey if you're going to use it, measuring spoons, and I think that you could have a little kit of everything you needed to start making watercolors for right around $100 US. I haven't done the specific math, I'm totally just estimating right now, but I think you could start as low as maybe around $100, maybe even cheaper if you thrifted a glass muller or used something a little bit different to mull your paint. As long as it is a flat, slightly abrasive glass surface, you can do that. I wouldn't recommend a mortar and pestle, as it's really going to limit your batch size and it's going to take longer to mull. but you definitely can lower the costs of getting started. And of course, if you started out with half a dozen really expensive pigments, you could easily be spending closer to $500 or $1,000, depending on how crazy you went. There's just such a huge range as far as price goes. That's not even to mention the amount of time it takes. So making your own watercolors is never going to be the fastest, easiest way to get watercolors. If you're looking for a cheap way to get watercolors, it's better to just start out with a set of watercolors like Sonnet or Paul Rubens, something that is still affordable but is pre-made. It'll save you time and you won't spend as much money. If your goal is just to get affordable watercolors as quickly as possible, making your own handmade paints is more about the hobby than having the final product, because it is going to take time and experimentation to get things right. It is really amazing and really fun to get to use your handmade watercolors, but if your goal is the final product, I may not recommend the hobby to you in the long term. It's really fun to experiment and try. It can be expensive, it doesn't have to be, so you really just have to weigh the pros and cons for yourself. Let's talk a little bit about binder. Should you make your own binder or get a pre-made binder? I can just tell you that I myself, when I was first getting started with, there's a hair in my eyeball. When I was first getting started with paint making, I started with a pre-made binder, I believe by Schminke, and I used that just to kind of take the difficulty of having to make my own binder perfectly on top of already making my own paints, which I hadn't done before. So I started with that, and once I had used that entire container of binder, I started experimenting with making my own. I started with gum arabic powder, but you can also start with already the liquid gum arabic or the gum arabic crystals. The crystals are the closest to the natural form of gum arabic, to where the powder has been more processed, ground up, and refined to remove any impurities. And then the more processed version of that is the liquid, which is probably going to be the already hydrated version of a powder or the crystals. You can use any of these, you just have to be willing to process the powder or the crystals. I haven't worked with gum arabic crystals very much myself yet. I do have them, but I haven't had the chance to experiment with them yet. I've mostly been using a mix of the powders with glycerin, honey, of course distilled water for the powder, and a little bit of clove oil, which is the oil I use as a preservative. I haven't tried any other oil types. I've heard that you can use others, but clove oil is the only one I've tried. I like the way it smells, and that's what I have. The other benefit to making your own binder over getting a pre-made binder is that every paint is a little bit different, every pigment that is. So some pigments may mix a little bit drier than others, and you may find that it's helpful to add a little bit more glycerin to a color or a little bit more honey to a particular mix, and a pre-made binder isn't going to allow you that sort of flexibility right out of the gate. A lot of you guys have been asking if I have any experience with making my own gouache. No, I do not. I have seen basically what some of you guys have seen if you look it up. I've seen people making gouache and they're adding like a chalk to it, which is something I don't really want to do. I don't really want to add that sort of filler to gouache. I don't know. I don't know how to make gouache. I'd like to learn someday. Let me know if any of you have any information about how to do that. Can you over mull a color? Can you mull a color so much that you've ruined it or wrecked it? I have never experienced overmulling. What can happen is the longer you have your batch out on the slab, it will start to dry out. So that water will start to evaporate. Usually what happens is this just makes the paint thicker. So even when I've had colors out on the slab for 3 or 4 hours, they usually just tend to get thicker, maybe dry a little around the edges. If I want to rehydrate that, I can just spray a little bit of distilled water. Make sure you're always using distilled water when making handmade watercolors, and that can reduce the possibility of mold and other things in your paint. Some of you guys have asked if I could share ratios for like a list of colors for all the colors I've made. I don't want to do that in a video. My long-term goals involve being able to have that information up on my website. So there would be a paint making tab on my website. You could go there, see the paints I've made so far, and my notes about making them. I'd love to be able to make that happen. I just haven't had the time yet, but it's definitely on my list of goals. I try to include ratios and any notes about specific colors when I make them for a video. For example, this yellow iron oxide is a 1-to-1 pigment to binder ratio, so equal parts binder and pigment. If you want to see how I make my handmade binder, I do have a separate video about that. Kind of in the vein of over mulling was the question of whether or not I ever scrap entire batches of paint because it wasn't working or something went wrong. The biggest reason that I have issues with paint making is because I get the ratios way off from the very beginning. So while my yellow iron oxide is a 1-to-1 ratio, equal parts binder and pigment, the way that it gets way off is when I add too much pigment and the paint needs way less. For example, a quinacridone rose is going to be closer to approximately a 10-to-1 ratio of binder to pigment. So 10 parts binder, 1 part pigment. So that color is only going to need a tiny bit of pigment. If you add too much pigment, it's just going to rub off when you swatch the color, and it's just not going to be adhering to the binder because there's not enough binder to hold all of the pigment. An example of how this can go very wrong is if I put my binder and pigment out onto the slab, start mixing it at like a 2-to-1 ratio, for example, or even a 4-to-1 ratio, I'm still gonna have way too much pigment for this mix, and I just have to keep adding binder, and what I'm doing is I'm increasing the amount of paint that I have out on the slab at one time, and it can get to be the batch size just gets too big for my glass slab. So then I have to remove some of the paint, put it in a container so I can work on the paint on a smaller amount, and then I have to keep adding binder, and then I have paint that's in the container that also doesn't have the correct amount of binder. So that can get really, really stressful. And of course, then it just takes so long. So again, the time when I have mistakes the most often is when I add too much pigment right out of the gate. It's better to be super hesitant unless you know already what those ratios are for a particular color. I'm not sure if I have ever just thrown away a complete batch. What has happened is I'll put it in a container, tell myself I'm going to work that color out later, and then I don't. It just sits in the container. Sometimes I'll open it up after a couple of months. If there's mold on it, then I'll just throw the whole thing away. Again, that has only happened a couple of times. I haven't really put in a ton of muscle work to make every single color perfect because, again, paint making is a hobby for me, and as you've seen, it's potentially a very time-consuming hobby. So it's not my full-time job. I have other things that I'm doing. I'm happy that I get to include it in my work and share videos like this one with you guys. But yes, it can happen that whole batches get scrapped if after months they get moldy and I throw them away. I never just throw away all my paint that's on a slab, but they can be massive, massive headaches sometimes. I wanted to add in at this point that I'm going to leave links to YouTube channels and websites that I have found to be good resources for paint making. So there are a couple other content creators who have made paint making content that I really enjoy. I'll leave links to their channels down below, and the resources that I have used, like where I get my pigments and articles I've read about binder ratios, all that stuff. Whatever I can find, I will leave it down in the description. If you guys have any resources that you have found, please leave those in the comments as well so we can build up a knowledge base together as much as possible. Another common question is, how much paint does it take to fill up a half pan? I've mentioned this before. When I'm filling half pans, I generally tend to do this in sections, in layers. Once I have completed a batch of paint, I will add just a small layer, maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of the half pan full of paint. I will allow that to dry completely, and then I will add another layer. As the layers dry, they will shrink because the moisture will evaporate so that the paint is dry. So it takes multiple pours, of course, to get a completely full half pan. That can vary a lot depending on the ratios of the paint, taking anywhere from 3 to 6 pours to get a completely full half pan. I keep my wet paint in a container like this. This is the yellow iron oxide that we're making in this video. I keep this in a drawer, out of the light, in a relatively cool place. Check it occasionally to make sure it's not molding. That can be more of an issue if you live in a more humid area. The humidity is not too high here now, especially during the winter, so I don't have very many issues with mold. And as long as I'm checking my paint regularly and mixing this paint up and regularly pouring it out, I don't have too much issues with my wet paint molding in containers like this. You guys also asked about light fastness. Am I doing light fastness tests for my paint? Yes, I swatched out all of my colors a few months ago, and they're sitting in the south-facing window in the other room on the other side of my house, and I will give you guys an update in a few months as far as light fastness goes. I swatched out each color and then covered half of the swatch with a thick piece of cardstock so that that half won't be disturbed by the light, and any fading will occur on the other half of the swatch that is allowed to be in direct light. So again, that's direct light, so any changes should be really apparent, and I will keep you guys updated on that. It just takes several months to properly test light fastness, really many months if you're doing a very accurate test. So I will let you guys know. I want to end on a big note with paint making, which is safety. How do you keep yourself safe when you're making paints? I have talked about this in previous videos, but I'll mention it here as well. And I'm going to kind of scoot over so I can make a little bit of a list here. 1, wear a respirator, which is something, a mask, like a Darth Vader style mask that is going to cover your mouth so that you're not inhaling pigment dust. Whether the pigment itself is toxic or not, you should never inhale pigment dust. It's not good to get that stuff in your mouth or your nose or your lungs. Don't inhale pigment dust. Make sure your mouth is always covered. I also wear an apron to keep paint off of my clothes. Usually it's watercolors, they're water soluble so you can rinse it out, but if they're staining pigments, that can be a little bit more hazardous for your clothing. I also sometimes, especially with colors that I know to be a little bit more messy, will wear gloves. This can protect your hands and your skin from the paint and pigment as well. To be honest, I hate gloves. I usually don't wear them. There have been some times where I have regretted not wearing gloves, so if you're concerned about safety, please do. Another thing is that I don't allow anyone else, like my husband or my children, to be in this room with me when I'm making paints, because I don't want them, because they're not going to be walking around the house with respirators, so I don't want them to be breathing in any of that dust as well. I don't keep food or drinks in here while I'm making paint. Again, anything that could potentially get contaminated while paint making, just keep it out of the room. On the websites where I buy my pigments, it will always say whether or not the pigment is potentially hazardous before you buy it. Kramer especially has a very extensive system for making sure that you know exactly what is in your pigment or exactly how toxic it may or may not be before you buy it. There are some pigments that specifically are more toxic, like cadmiums and things like that, that you can't purchase without providing some sort of proof to them that you are professional and you're licensed to be handling some of those substances. Hopefully I have answered a bunch of questions for you guys here today. If you asked me a paint making question over in the community tab sometime in the past week and I didn't answer it in this video, I'm hoping to reply to as many of those comments over there as I can. And if you have any other questions, maybe something I answered here for you today has brought up a new question that you have, please do leave it down in the comments and I will do my very best to get to as many of them as I can. If you are a paint maker and you know answers to any of the questions that you see, please do let us all know in the comments as well. Thank you guys so much for sharing this hobby with me. I'm really excited to get to kind of work through all of this stuff with you guys together. Again, I've only been doing this for about a year, but it's been a really exciting thing to get to do on the channel with all of you. And again, if you're interested in trying 2 free months of Skillshare Premium, check out the link down in the description, and I will see you guys next week. Bye bye.